Okay, let me go back to Carl. Carl, Fortune magazine is reporting that there is interest from Saudi Arabia in investing in U.S. energy producers, particularly in the shale industry. What is prompting Saudi Arabia to do this, and how big a shift is it?
Well, I mean, everybody wants to be part of any kind of good investment, and right now we're seeing that's where the investment goes. I mean, one of the things that really makes a difference here is that we're not just talking about oil, we're talking about commodities as a whole. And when we talk about that, we're talking about trade balance. And that's been a key word for this, or key phrase of this administration. It's all about trade balance. So as we increase our exports, we're going to start increasing a lot of our imports too, or hope to. We have to figure out where that balance lies. So, I mean, when you talk about the Saudis, who've been great consumers of American goods for such a long time, now we have to wonder if we're going to push out more oil and take less of their oil, where's that balance going to come now?
And Francisco, what other responses have you seen from foreign oil producers responding to increased U.S. production? I mean, what do they do to maintain their market share or even increase their market share?
Yeah, well, I mean, we are seeing, because of the increase in the price of oil that we had in the last year, we have seen other producers that are not in the OPEC Russia deal, like Canada, increasing production. But the question is, I mean, for most OPEC producers, they until 2018 they have a deal to keep the cuts. But what do they do in the future? And I mean, there are countries like Mexico and Venezuela in which production is declining without the cuts. It's just because of the mismanagement of the oil industry or the lack of investment in the last few years. There are other countries like Iraq or Saudi Arabia that have to think hard if it is in their interest to stay with this lower oil production while the U.S. takes over their market. So I think the cracks are going to start to be seen in this coalition of oil producers if the U.S. increases production as expected in 1.3 million barrels in 2018. And of course, it will depend a lot also on how much the demand growth continues to. I mean, there is a healthy demand growth at the moment because of the growth in the world economy, but how long that is going to be sustained.
If I may, I believe the key word to understand oil policy, diversification. All countries are interested in diversifying their energy mix.
And that's why Venezuela has a problem right now, right?
Yeah. And mainly moving away from oil, the fastest growing source of energy is renewable energy, right. Solar and winds. All countries, including United States, China is taking the lead in renewable energy. In nuclear power, China is building more nuclear reactors than any country in the world. In United States and in Europe, nuclear power kind of took backseat because of Fukushima and other reasons. But I mean, some people argue now that oil era is over. I do not believe so. Oil still is a dominant source of energy, but certainly there is interest in other sources of energy, especially natural gas and renewable.
Brian, and I guess one other factor which would probably act in the interest of the United States is that for a long time, the U.S. was not allowed to export oil.
Right. Correct. Yes,
Congress stopped that.
There were some exceptions, but for the most part, all of the limits on U.S. crude exports were lifted in 2015, a deal between Congress and the Obama administration. Exports have slowly ramped up. We're at about 1.5 million barrels per day. China is taking about 20% of that oil. And if you see what that sort of created in the United States, there's a view on how much we're keeping in storage, our stockpile. This so-called strategic petroleum reserve, which holds at the moment, about 665 million barrels per day. The Congress and the administration just reached this budget deal last week to sell off 100 million barrels of that. And that's sort of been what's going on for the past few years, selling a few million barrels here and there. That's going on while China is building up their own government stockpile. So that shows you the way that things are shifting sort of in the U.S. market. And it gets us into that thing of the view moving away from scarcity now into abundance.
But has it also had the effect, Brian, in the United States of increasing investment and also increasing production, the fact that you can now export to the world?
Sorry, I think you can see that in the Permian with the way that the Permian in Texas and New Mexico, where you can see the way that production there is ramping up. There's a whole new markets that you can get into. The U.S. is still importing, and the light crude that's being produced in the U.S. isn't necessarily preferred by most of the refineries in the United States. So they needed that new market, and I think that they're seeking that out.
Gawdat, one diplomatic, political question. To what extent does this relative self-sufficiency in the United States relieve this country to act militarily if tensions rise or escalate, say, between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
In my understanding, our leaders, military leaders, when they make the decision to use military force, there are many factors to consider. And certainly because the United States is less dependent on imported oil, has more freedom. But there are many other factors. We are very concerned about American life, other people's life, about the impact of our intervention. So in my opinion, I believe the biggest benefit of low oil prices, this growing American economy, on average, American household has saved about $1,200 because low energy prices. And this helped United States, helped American soft power. Right. This energy revolution, shale gas, came from private sector, private American companies, not government intervention. So it shows the word that the private sector works, the market works.
Carl, if we look at the Trump administration, political question here, they've been rolling back many of the environmental regulations, restrictions that have been in place, expanding energy leasing in federal territories. Do you think in the long run that's going to affect production here radically?
Well, it does open up opportunity, and I think that this is what this administration wants. They want to provide more opportunity for American workers here. So I think that's where we can see that there's going to be growth and an ability to grow. But the key here is also, remember, when we talk about energy diversity, it's not just crude oil. It's also about refined products. So in the U.S. here, we can grow your crude production, offshore, onshore, but we're very, very limited by how much refinery capacity we can grow. And I think that's where the diversity comes when it comes to other countries like China or Saudi Arabia, or even anywhere else in the Middle East. We can see refinery production grow there and refinery growth.
Francisco, the United States has used sanctions as an instrument of foreign policy in many instances. Does the fact that there's now less reliance on oil imports give the U.S. more leverage to impose sanctions as they've done on Russia, or as they may do on Venezuela?
I think so. I mean, without a doubt, it's different when you are thinking about imposing sanctions and that in circumstances in which that will lead to a significant spike in the price of oil and will have a significant negative effect on your economy. This is not the case right now, and we can see it. For example, Venezuela has been already imposed some sanctions on the financial side, and that has led to a decline to Venezuelan export to the U.S. to about half, and the effect has been very limited. And so it does give some additional freedom to the U.S. when they are thinking about imposing sanctions, particularly sanctions that will affect the oil industry. On the other hand, as was mentioned before, this is an integrated world oil market, and as a result, if the result of sanctions is a significant reduction in production in a particular country that then leads to a spike in the price of oil, it could also affect other economies in the world, like China or Japan or the European economies, and as a result, that could have a detrimental effect eventually to the world economy, to the U.S., and to the interest of some allies of the U.S. So it's not like they totally disregard the effect, but it's less pronounced than it was before.
I'm sorry, Carl, did you want to say something on the issue?
No, I agree. I think that, the one thing that we have to remember is that as an American country, we want to see growth here. We want to see economic growth. But, like Francisco just said, we rely on other countries' economies too. So I agree with that.
Brian, in 2012, during the election campaign, prices of oil at that point getting up to $4 a gallon. President Obama said, we can't drill our way to lower gas prices. That was in response, of course, to the Sarah Palin mantra, drill, baby, drill. Was the president wrong at that point?
Well, you heard what they were talking about was some of the refinery constraints you're seeing, and that's influencing gasoline prices, which we saw before. Those are again creeping up. You can expand. You can open up more opportunities. Say the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic, the Pacific is now being considered by the Trump administration, but that doesn't necessarily mean that producers want to drill there. And a lot of the things you're seeing, and a lot of the reason that analysts I talk to are saying that the Trump administration's deregulatory agenda isn't having that much of an influence on production here, is because it's taking place on state and private land. It's not necessarily on. Producers aren't necessarily seeking out federal lands or new federal waters to drill because they're getting what they can from the Permian or the Bakken or the Eagle Ford, if you will. There's almost a glut of opportunity at this point.
If I may add one point here, I believe it is not accurate to give credit to one administration for this shale revolution. The revolution was carried out by American private companies. It is not Trump administration or Obama administration. It is the technology in the United States introduced, developed by private sector. And probably this, for example, the White House, there are solar panels, energy efficiency. The thing which will add to the change in energy landscape, electric cars. All major car companies are switching to electric cars. This will change oil market.
Gentlemen, that's where we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter @CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.